I'm Evelyn Reed, 82, a woman, and I saw my daughter-in-law cheating on my son at a family wedding, so I quietly took back everything and saved my family. They say hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but they never considered the cold, calculating rage of a mother who sees her child being destroyed. Scorn is a hot, messy emotion. What I felt was something far more dangerous, a quiet, chilling clarity. The kind of clarity that can move mountains or, in this case, remove a cancer from the heart of a family. It all happened on what should have been one of the happiest days of our lives, the wedding of my granddaughter, Chloe. She is David's only child, my only grandchild, the bright, beautiful result of a life my late husband, Richard, and I had built from nothing. Richard and I started Reed and Son Timber with a single truck and a plot of land nobody wanted. Over 50 years, we turned it into an empire that sustained not just us, but our entire community. When Richard passed 10 years ago, he left me as the matriarch of this legacy, a responsibility I have never taken lightly. Our son, David, was the heart of the company, just as Richard had been. He had his father's kindness and his steadfast nature, but he lacked Richard's healthy skepticism of human nature. David saw the world through a lens of inherent goodness, which made him a wonderful man but a terrible judge of character. And his most profound misjudgment was Laura. She came into our lives 25 years ago, a whirlwind of charm and ambition. She was working in the marketing department of a firm we'd hired. She was beautiful, intelligent, and her focus on David was so intense it was almost blinding. I remember the first time he brought her to the house for Sunday dinner. She walked into our home, her eyes not lingering on the family photos or the worn, comfortable furniture, but on the paintings on the wall, the silver on the table, the subtle indicators of wealth. I saw it then, a flicker of something acquisitive in her gaze, but I dismissed it. My son was in love, truly, deeply in love for the first time in his life, and what mother wants to be the cynical old woman who casts a shadow on that? Richard was less convinced. She's a climber, Ev, he'd murmured to me one night after they'd left. She looks at David, but she sees the company. I hushed him, told him he was being unfair, but a seed of doubt had been planted. Over the years, there were signs, of course. Small things easily explained away. There was the matter of their first home. David, ever practical, had found a lovely, sensible house in a good school district. Laura had thrown a quiet, dignified fit. It wasn't a tantrum. Laura was too clever for that. It was a performance of quiet disappointment, of dreams being gently crushed. She spoke of entertaining for the business, of upholding the Reed name. She didn't want a home, she wanted a statement piece. They ended up in a sprawling mansion that cost 3 times as much, a house that always felt more like a hotel than a home. David, wanting only to see her happy, signed the papers without a second thought. Then there was her insistence on managing their social investments, as she called them. She cultivated friendships not with people she seemed to genuinely like, but with those whose names appeared in the society pages. She pushed David to join exclusive country clubs and charity boards, not for the camaraderie or the cause, but for the connections. She treated our family's reputation as her personal currency. Once I overheard her on the phone with one of her new, wealthy friends laughing. "Oh, David is a saint," she'd said a little too brightly. "He lets me handle all the important things. He's much more concerned with the trees than the portfolio." It was phrased as a compliment, but the condescension was a poisoned dart aimed right at my son's humble nature. He loved the trees. He loved the smell of sawdust and the satisfaction of a hard day's work. It was the foundation of everything she was enjoying, and she spoke of it as a quaint little hobby. I never said anything directly to David. How could I? He adored her. He saw her ambition as a reflection of her love for the family, her social climbing as a desire to elevate their shared status. He saw a partner. I saw a parasite cloaked in Chanel and a brilliant smile. But I held my tongue, burying my misgivings under the heavy weight of a mother's hope. I hoped I was wrong. I prayed I was. For 25 years, I maintained a cordial, if not warm, relationship with my daughter-in-law for the sake of my son's happiness. But on that perfect, sun-drenched afternoon at Chloe's wedding, as the string quartet played and the champagne flowed, my prayers went unanswered. The time for hope was over. The time for action was about to begin. The foundation of my son's life was a lie, and I, his mother, was the only one who had just stumbled upon the horrifying truth. Oh, the wedding was held at a vineyard estate an hour north of the city, a place of rolling hills and ancient oak trees that reminded me of the land where Richard and I first started. It was Chloe's choice, a nod to the family's roots in the timber trade. The air was warm, smelling of cut grass and blooming roses. Everything was perfect, too perfect. Perfection is a veneer, and I've lived long enough to know that the more polished the surface, the more likely it is to hide a rot within. Laura was in her element. She glided through the crowd, a vision in a dove-gray dress that must have cost a fortune. Her smile was radiant, her posture impeccable. She was playing the role of the proud, loving mother of the bride to perfection. She would touch Chloe's arm gently, her eyes misting over with what looked like maternal pride. She would clasp the hands of arriving guests, remembering the names of their children, asking after their health with a sincerity that was utterly believable. To the untrained eye, she was the epitome of grace and class. But I was not an untrained eye. I was the woman who had sat across from her at 2 decades of holiday dinners. I knew the mechanics of her smile. I could distinguish the genuine, rare warmth from the polished, public performance. And that day it was all performance. Her eyes, while bright, never quite settled. They were constantly scanning, flitting over the heads of the people she was talking to, searching for someone or something in the crowd. My son David followed her like a planet orbiting its sun. The love in his eyes was so pure, so absolute, it was painful to watch. He was 50 years old, a successful man in his own right, the acting CEO of a major company, but around Laura, he was still the boy who couldn't believe his luck. He'd come up behind her, wrap his arms around her waist, and she would lean back into him with a sigh that seemed to say, "This is where I belong." But I saw the subtle tension in her shoulders, the fractional delay before she relaxed into his embrace. It was the sigh of an actress sinking into character, not a wife sinking into the arms of her husband. During the ceremony, as Chloe and her young man exchanged their vows under a canopy of white roses, I watched my son. He wasn't looking at the bride and groom. He was looking at Laura, who was dabbing a single perfect tear from the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief, a tear for the occasion, a tear for the audience. David reached out and squeezed her hand, his expression one of profound, shared emotion. He believed they were sharing this moment, this parental milestone. But Laura's grip, I noted, was limp. Her focus was distant. At the reception, held in a magnificent old barn that had been converted into a grand hall, she gave a speech. It was eloquent, touching, and funny. She spoke of Chloe as a little girl, sharing a sweet, carefully curated anecdote. She praised her new son-in-law, and then she turned to David. "And to my wonderful husband, David," she said, her voice catching just so. "None of this, none of our happiness would be possible without you. You are my rock, my heart, and the best man I have ever known." The room erupted in applause. David beamed, his face flushed with pride and love. He looked utterly besotted. I clapped along with everyone else, the sound of my hands hitting each other feeling hollow and distant. The words were perfect. Every single one of them was a lie. I didn't know how I knew, not yet, but the certainty of it settled in my bones with a deep, unshakable chill. A rock is something you stand on, something that supports you. But a rock can also be something you use, something you step on to get to higher ground. I was beginning to understand which one she meant. Later, as the band played and the younger guests took to the dance floor, I found a quiet seat on the veranda, needing a moment away from the noise. From my vantage point, I could see the whole party unfolding. I saw Chloe and her husband, lost in their own world. I saw David, laughing with some business associates, his eyes periodically searching the room for Laura. And I saw Laura. She was talking to a group of her society friends, laughing her tinkling, public laugh. But her body was angled away from them, her attention clearly elsewhere. She kept glancing towards a side exit, a small, discreet door that led out into the formal gardens. She checked the tiny, diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist not once but 3 times in as many minutes. She was waiting, anxious. It was the first real crack in her perfect facade, a hairline fracture of impatience that no one else seemed to notice. But I did, and I watched. The sun had begun its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. The golden hour light spilled across the vineyard, making everything look soft and romantic. Inside the reception hall, the energy was high. Toasts had been made, the cake had been cut, and the dance floor was a swirling mass of celebration. My son David was dancing with his daughter, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on his face. It was a perfect portrait of fatherly love. That was when I saw Laura make her move. She'd been standing near the edge of the dance floor, watching them with that same practiced maternal smile. She caught David's eye, blew him a little kiss, and then turned. With a quiet word to a nearby cousin about needing a bit of fresh air, she began to walk, not towards the main entrance or the veranda where other guests were mingling, but towards that small, secondary door I had seen her watching earlier. It was the service exit, the one leading to the less trafficked part of the gardens behind the catering prep area. My heart began to beat a little faster. It wasn't a conscious decision, not at first. It was an instinct, ancient and powerful, the same instinct that makes a doe raise her head at the scent of a predator on the wind. Something was wrong. The air was thick with it. I stood up, my joints protesting slightly, and made my way through the throng of guests. I kept my expression placid, smiling and nodding at people I passed, a harmless old woman heading for the powder room. No one paid me any mind. I was invisible, a relic of a bygone era, the quiet matriarch in the corner. It was a role I had played for years, and it had never served me better than it did in that moment. I slipped through the same side door Laura had used. The blast of noise from the party was instantly muffled, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of the kitchen staff. I found myself in a narrow, stone-paved alley that ran along the back of the barn. It was dimly lit by a single wrought-iron lantern. The alley opened up into a secluded garden terrace, a small, flagstone patio surrounded by high, clipped hedges and overflowing pots of white hydrangeas. It was designed for privacy. And there she was. Laura was not alone. She was standing with a man, his back to me. He was tall, with dark hair, dressed in a suit as sharp and expensive as her dress. Her entire posture was different from the one she wore inside. The perfect, rigid grace was gone. She was leaning towards him, one hand on his arm, her body language radiating a familiar, desperate intimacy. They weren't just talking. This was not a casual conversation with a fellow guest. A cold dread, sharp and painful, pierced through my chest. I shrank back into the shadows of the alley, my body pressed against the cool stone of the barn wall, my breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. I could only watch as the perfectly constructed world of my son's life began to splinter before my very eyes. The man turned his head slightly, and I saw his profile in the dim light. He was handsome, with a certain roguish charm that I instantly distrusted. It was a face built for lies and easy conquests. Laura looked up at him, her face alight with an emotion I had never, not once, seen her direct at my son. It was raw, unguarded, and full of a longing that was almost feral. He reached out and tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture so intimate, so proprietary that it felt like a physical blow. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. The scene was utterly silent from my vantage point, yet it screamed with betrayal. The high hedges that were meant to create a romantic, private nook had become the walls of a secret chamber where my family was being torn apart. I stood there, hidden in the darkness, a ghost at the scene of the crime, and waited for the words that I knew would confirm my worst fears. The silence was broken by the man's voice, a low, smooth baritone that oozed confidence. "You're playing a dangerous game, Laurie," he murmured, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. Laurie, a name from her past, I presumed. A name that didn't belong in this life she had so carefully constructed. Laura let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a sound I had never heard from her before. It was entirely devoid of her usual tinkling charm. "What part of my life isn't a game, Mark?" she replied, her voice tight with a tension that was 25 years in the making. "Mark, so he had a name." "He adores you," Mark said, a hint of amusement in his tone. "The way he looks at you, it's like a teenager with his first crush. It's almost sad." "Don't," Laura whispered, though there was no force behind it. "David is a good man." "He's a simple man," Mark corrected her gently. "He's a provider. A stable, boring, incredibly rich provider. You got what you wanted, didn't you? The house, the status, the endless river of money." My blood ran cold. I pressed myself flatter against the stone wall, praying the shadows would hold me. Every word was a hammer blow against the foundation of my son's happiness. Laura pulled away from him slightly, pacing the small space like a caged animal. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice dropping to a raw, confessional whisper. When I left you, I was 23, I was scared. My family had nothing. You had nothing but big dreams and a beat-up car. David was security. The Reed name, the money, it was a life raft. I told myself I could learn to love him. And did you? Mark pressed, stepping closer to her again. She stopped pacing and looked him straight in the eye. The moonlight caught the sheen of tears on her face, but they were not the delicate, dignified tears she had shed during the ceremony. These were tears of rage, of regret, of a life spent in a gilded cage of her own making. I never loved him, Mark, she said, and the words, though spoken softly, were the most violent thing I had ever heard. Not like I loved you, I respect him, I'm even fond of him the way you're fond of a loyal old dog. But love, the kind that sets you on fire, the kind that makes you feel alive, I haven't felt that since I left you. I felt my knees weaken. The image of a loyal old dog, my son, my kind, trusting David, flashed in my mind, and a wave of protective fury so intense it almost made me sick washed over me. I had to physically bite down on my tongue to keep from storming out of the shadows and striking that perfectly made-up face. Mark reached out and pulled her into his arms. She went willingly, melting against him, her head fitting perfectly into the crook of his neck. It was a practiced embrace, one they had clearly shared many times before. "So what are we doing here, Laurie?" he whispered into her hair. "Are you just torturing us both, showing up at my cousin's wedding?" His cousin's wedding, so this wasn't a chance encounter, this was planned. "I had to see you," she breathed. "This whole day watching Chloe so young and in love, it's killing me. I chose the cage, Mark, the beautiful, comfortable cage, and now the door is rusted shut." She pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "Just tell me one thing, was it a mistake leaving you?" He looked down at her, a sad, knowing smile on his face. "We would have been gloriously happy and tragically poor," he said. "Instead, you're miserably rich, and I'm doing okay, but I've never forgotten you." He leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't a tentative, questioning kiss. It was deep and possessive, a kiss of shared history and profound betrayal. I didn't need to see any more. I had the truth, ugly and raw and irrefutable. I turned, my movements stiff and silent, and retreated back into the narrow alley. The music and laughter from the reception hall seemed to be coming from another world, a world I no longer belonged to. My heart was a block of ice in my chest. The shock had passed, and in its place something else was crystallizing. It was cold, it was hard, it was resolve. I straightened my shawl, smoothed the front of my dress, and composed my features into a mask of serene, grandmotherly calm. I walked back into the party. David saw me and his face lit up. He came over, leaving the dance floor. "There you are, Mom," he said, smiling. "I was looking for you. Isn't this the best night?" I looked into his dear, innocent face and I smiled back. "Yes, darling," I said, my voice perfectly even. "It's a night none of us will ever forget." The week after the wedding was one of the longest of my life. I existed in a strange, bifurcated reality. On the surface, everything was normal. I answered the phone, I tended to my garden, I read my books. I accepted the gushing thank you call from Chloe, who was blissfully happy on her honeymoon. I even endured a lunch with Laura, who was back to playing her role as the dutiful daughter-in-law, discussing the wedding photographs and the thank you notes with her usual meticulous attention to detail. Sitting across from her in the sunlit dining room of her monstrously large house, listening to her talk was a form of exquisite torture. Every smile, every seemingly innocuous comment was layered with the horror of what I had heard. When she praised David for being so generous, I heard her calling him a loyal old dog. When she talked about their future, about growing old together, I saw her in the arms of another man, mourning the life she'd thrown away for my son's money. I felt a rage so profound it was almost silent. It wasn't a hot, explosive anger, but a cold, dense fury that settled deep in my gut. It was the rage of a mother whose child had been grievously wounded without even knowing it. David was walking around with a knife in his back and he was smiling, telling everyone how wonderful his life was. The injustice of it was a physical weight. Several times I nearly broke. I would look at David, see the unadorned love on his face as he looked at his wife, and the words would rise in my throat. "She's lying to you, it's all a lie," but I would swallow them down, choking on their bitterness. I couldn't just tell him, he wouldn't believe me, he would see it as the rambly NGS of a jealous, meddling old woman. He would defend her and it would drive a wedge between us, perhaps irreparably. Laura would play the victim, a role she had perfected, and I would be the villain. No, a simple accusation was a battle I would lose. This wasn't a battle. This was a war, and I needed a strategist. On the fifth day after the wedding, I picked up the phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Arthur Vance, please, it's Evelyn Reed calling. Arthur had been my husband's best friend since childhood and our family's lawyer for 50 years. He was 80 years old, sharp as a tack, and one of the few people on earth I trusted implicitly. He knew our family, he knew our business, and he had been there when Richard and I had laid the first foundations of our life together. Like Richard, Arthur had always been polite to Laura, but I had sensed a professional reserve in him, a watchfulness that mirrored my own. His secretary put me through immediately. Evelyn, Arthur's familiar, gravelly voice said, "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "Arthur, I need to see you," I said, my own voice tight. "It's a personal matter, a family matter, it's urgent." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Arthur knew my temperament. I was not a woman given to drama or false emergencies. "My office, an hour," he said simply. Arthur's office was in an old, respectable brick building downtown. It smelled of old books, leather, and strong coffee. It was a place of quiet confidence and sober truths. He greeted me himself at the door, his kind, wrinkled face etched with concern. He led me to his private study, closing the heavy oak door behind us. "All right, Evelyn," he said, sitting down behind his large mahogany desk. "What happened?" I didn't prevaricate, I didn't cry. I simply laid it all out, my voice as steady and cold as I could make it. I told him about the wedding, about the perfect facade, about the nagging feeling that something was wrong. I described the scene in the garden, repeating the conversation I had overheard, word for damning word. Arthur listened without interruption, his hands steepled in front of him, his gaze fixed on my face. His expression grew graver with every sentence. When I finished, the silence in the room was heavy and profound. He finally let out a long, slow breath. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said, his voice full of genuine sympathy. "Truly sorry for you and for David." He shook his head slowly. "I can't say I'm entirely surprised. Richard had his reservations from the very beginning, didn't he?" As I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "He called her a climber." "That he did," Arthur said grimly. "But this is more than climbing. This is a hostile takeover. That man she was with, Mark Jennings. Does the name mean anything to you?" "Nothing," I said. "She called him an old love from before she met David." "I'll have my people look into him," Arthur said, already shifting into professional mode. "But the more immediate problem is Laura. You're right, you can't just confront David. He's blind to her. An accusation from you without irrefutable proof would be a catastrophe." "So what do we do?" I asked, feeling the first flicker of hope since that horrible night. Arthur leaned forward, his eyes, though old, were sharp and clear. "We fight fire with ice, Evelyn. She thinks she's clever, but she's an amateur playing in the big leagues. Her weakness is the very thing she worships, money. She confessed that she married David for it. That kind of greed leaves a trail." He paused, his gaze meeting mine. "We need to conduct a full forensic audit of their finances. Joint accounts, credit cards, her personal business ventures, everything. We need to see if her betrayal extends beyond the emotional and into the financial. I suspect it does." "And if it does," Arthur said, a hard edge to his voice, "we gather the ammunition. We build a case so solid, so undeniable that when we present it to David, he will have no choice but to see the truth. We don't just prove she's an adulterer, we prove she's a thief. The one is a matter of the heart and he might forgive it. The other is a matter of calculated predatory deceit. He won't forgive that." He stood up and walked over to the window, looking down at the street below. "This won't be pleasant, Evelyn. We may uncover things that are deeply ugly." "Arthur," I said, my own voice as hard as his. "She called my son a loyal old dog. There is nothing you can find that is uglier than that. Do it. Do whatever it takes." He turned back to me and gave a single, firm nod. The War Council was adjourned. The plan was in motion. The following weeks were a masterclass in quiet, methodical warfare. While I continued my charade of serene domesticity, Arthur Vance assembled his army. He operated with the precision of a surgeon and the discretion of a spy master. He engaged a forensic accountant, a woman named Ms. Gable, who was renowned for her ability to find needles in financial haystacks, and a private investigator, a quiet, unassuming man named Mr. Harris. They were my secret soldiers, and their battlefield was the paper trail of Laura's life. The first reports started coming in within a week. They were delivered to me by Arthur, not over the phone or by email, but in sealed manila envelopes during quiet meetings in his office. Each report was a fresh layer of filth on the woman my son called his wife. Mr. Harris, the investigator, was the first to strike gold. He had identified Mark Jennings. It turned out he wasn't just some long-lost college flame. He was a moderately successful real estate developer with a reputation for living well beyond his means and a string of failed high-risk ventures. More damningly, he and Laura had not lost touch. They had been in intermittent contact for years. Mr. Harris provided photographs that made my stomach clench. Laura and Mark having lunch at a discreet restaurant in a neighboring city 2 months ago. Laura's car parked outside a boutique hotel for an afternoon a month before that. The wedding was not a reunion. It was a continuation. Then came Ms. Gable's findings, and they were devastating. Laura was not just an unfaithful wife, she was a meticulous, calculating embezzler. For years, she had been systematically siphoning money from David. It wasn't clumsy, obvious theft, it was sophisticated. She had convinced David to give her control over a joint investment account meant for their future, arguing that her background in marketing gave her a better sense of market trends. From this account, she had been making regular, seemingly legitimate investments. But Ms. Gable dug deeper. She found that several of these investments were in shell corporations, companies that existed only on paper, and the address for these corporations, they all led back to a single P.O. box. And who was the signatory on that P.O. box? Mark Jennings. Laura was bleeding my son's money and funneling it directly to her lover to prop up his failing business ventures. The total was staggering, over $1 million in the last 5 years alone. I sat in Arthur's office, the damning documents spread out on the polished mahogany desk between us. There were bank statements, corporate filings, surveillance photos. It was a mountain of deceit. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were reading about fictional characters in a sordid novel. But then I would see David's signature on an account authorization form, his open, trusting script next to her elegant, predatory one, and the cold fury would return. "There's more," Arthur said, his voice grim. He pushed another document across the desk. It was a copy of a property deed. She used funds from that same account 2 years ago as a down payment on a condominium. It's in a private, gated community an hour away. The deed is in her maiden name, Laura Peterson. "A love nest," I said, the words tasting like ash. "A getaway," Arthur corrected, "and I suspect an escape hatch. She was building herself a lifeboat, Evelyn, with your son's money." That was the detail that broke through my icy composure, the sheer, calculated premeditation of it all. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary weakness. This was a long con, a 25-year operation to secure her own future at the expense of my son's heart and his fortune. My resolve hardened from steel into diamond. Any lingering wisp of doubt, any thought that perhaps this could be handled quietly, that David's heart could be spared the full extent of the damage, evaporated. He had to know. He had to know everything. He had to see the viper he had been sleeping next to for a quarter of a century. I looked at Arthur. "There's the prenuptial agreement, isn't there?" He nodded, ironclad. "Richard and I insisted on it. David fought us on it, said it was unromantic. But we held firm. It states very clearly that in the event of a divorce, she is entitled only to what she brought into the marriage and half of any assets accumulated in accounts held jointly in both their names. It also has a fidelity clause. A proven case of adultery negates her claim on even those joint assets." "And these shell corporations?" I asked. "The condo?" "They are solely in her name or the names of her fake companies," Arthur said, a grim smile touching his lips. "She was so busy being clever and secretive, she legally insulated David from her theft. The money is gone, but she can't touch another penny of his personal fortune or the company. The prenup protects it all. Good, I said, my voice low. I began to gather the papers, my hands steady, arranging them into a neat, damning pile. It's time, Arthur. It's time to schedule a meeting. The ammunition was gathered, the target was identified, the battlefield was chosen. All that was left was the final judgment. I chose the location with deliberate, symbolic NT. NT, the main boardroom at the Reed and Son corporate headquarters. It was a room that represented the heart of our family's legacy. One entire wall was a single pane of glass overlooking the timber yard, the place where my husband and my son had worked side by side for decades. The opposite wall was lined with portraits, my father-in-law, my husband Richard, and an empty space waiting for David. The room smelled of cedar and power. It was our ground. I had Arthur call the meeting under the pretext of an urgent quarterly estate planning review. It was formal enough that Laura's presence would be required, but vague enough not to arouse immediate suspicion. David, of course, agreed without question. Business was business. They arrived together, but the contrast between them was stark. David looked tired but relaxed, dressed in his usual comfortable work attire. He smiled when he saw me, coming over to kiss my cheek. "Mom, Arthur," he said warmly, "everything all right?" Laura, however, was on high alert. She was dressed not in her usual glamorous attire, but in a severe, dark gray business suit, as if armored for battle. Her smile was brittle, and her eyes darted from me to Arthur, trying to read the room. She sensed a trap, even if she couldn't see its teeth. "David, Laura, please sit down," Arthur said, his tone formal and grave. He remained standing at the head of the long mahogany table. I sat to his right, a silent, black-clad figure of judgment. The pile of manila envelopes sat innocently in the center of the table. "What's this all about, Arthur?" Laura asked, her voice a little too sharp. "I had to cancel a luncheon for this." Arthur ignored her. He looked directly at David. "David, what we are about to discuss will be difficult, but it is of the utmost importance to the future of this family and this company." David looked confused, a frown creasing his brow. "Okay." Arthur opened the first envelope. He slid a single 8x10 photograph across the polished surface of the table. It stopped directly in front of David. It was a crystal-clear image of Laura and Mark Jennings, locked in their passionate kiss on the garden terrace at the wedding. Time seemed to stop. David stared at the photograph, the color drained from his face. He looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief, first at me, then at Arthur, and finally at his wife. "Laura, what is this? This has to be fake. It's some kind of joke." "Is it a joke, Laura?" Arthur asked, his voice like stone. Laura's face was a mask of practiced outrage. "This is insane. It's slanderous. How dare you? Who is that man? I've never seen him before in my life." Arthur simply opened the second envelope and slid out another set of photos. Laura and Mark at lunch. Laura's car at the hotel. "You've never seen Mr. Mark Jennings before?" Arthur pressed. "Your college boyfriend, the beneficiary of your investments." David was shaking his head, trying to process it. "Laura, just tell them it's a mistake." "It is," she insisted, her voice rising. "Your mother has always hated me. This is her trying to poison you against me." I remained silent. My fury was a cold, solid core within me, but my face was impassive. I would not give her the satisfaction of a reaction. Then Arthur laid out the final pieces: the bank statements, the corporate filings for the shell companies, the property deed for the condominium with the name Laura Peterson clearly visible. He explained it all calmly, methodically, relentlessly. He didn't use accusatory language, he just stated the facts, letting the evidence speak for itself. Each document was a nail in the coffin of her lies. With every new piece of evidence, David sank lower in his chair. The initial disbelief gave way to a dawning, sickening horror. He picked up one of the bank statements, his hands trembling, tracing the path of the money from his account to hers, to a company he'd never heard of. The lie was too big, too detailed, too meticulously documented to deny. He finally looked at Laura. The love and adoration that had defined his gaze for 25 years was gone, replaced by something broken and hollow. Why? He whispered, the word barely audible. All this, the lies, why? Laura saw that she had lost him. Her mask of outrage crumbled, and for a single, fleeting moment, I saw the real woman beneath, a panicked, desperate creature caught in a trap of her own design. Her response was not remorse, it was venom. Why? She spat, turning on him. Because I was drowning and you were a life raft. I gave you 25 years of my life. I gave you a child. I built your social standing. You think any of this, she gestured wildly around the boardroom, would be as successful without me? I earned that money. I was taking what I was owed. It was the final, fatal mistake. She had just confessed. David flinched as if she had struck him. He stood up slowly, his face a ruin of devastation. He looked older suddenly. Woo. And dead beyond measure. Get out, he said, his voice quiet but shaking with a force I had never heard from him. David, she began, her tone shifting, trying to find a new tactic. Get out, he roared, pointing a trembling finger toward the door. Get out of this building, get out of my life. Laura stared at him, her mouth open, finally rendered speechless. She looked at Arthur, who met her gaze without blinking. She looked at me, and in my eyes she found no pity, only the cold, hard finality of her defeat. She stood, gathered her purse, and with one last, hate-filled glare at me, she walked out of the boardroom. The click of the door closing behind her was the loudest sound I had ever heard. The fight was over. David collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, and finally began to sob. I went to him, putting my hand on his shoulder, the first time I had touched my son since this nightmare began. The war was won, but the cost was immense. Now the long, slow work of healing would have to begin. And that's how it ended, not with a bang, but with the quiet, decisive click of a boardroom door. The divorce was swift and brutal, just as Arthur had planned. The prenup held. Laura left with the clothes on her back and the few $1,000s she had in the bank account she'd had when she first met David. The condominium, purchased with stolen funds, was seized and sold. She tried to fight, of course. Her lawyers made noise, they threatened, but faced with the mountain of evidence against her, they quietly folded. She vanished from our lives, a ghost of a memory. I heard much later that she had ended up with Mark Jennings, the two of them living in a small, rented apartment, their shared greed having consumed all they had stolen. But my story isn't about her punishment. It's about my son's survival. The aftermath was difficult. David was a broken man for a long time. He had lost not just a wife, but the entire reality he had believed in for half his life. There was shame, there was anger, and there was a grief so profound it was like a physical illness. We spent many long evenings in silence, just sitting together, the way we used to when he was a little boy with a scraped knee. I didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. I just offered my presence, a steady, unwavering rock in the storm of his pain. Slowly, very slowly, he began to heal. He threw himself into the company, into the tangible reality of the timber and the trees, the legacy his father had left him. He reconnected with old friends Laura had deemed unimportant. He spent more time with Chloe, their bond deepening in the shared wound. The man who emerged from the fire was different. He was quieter, more cautious, but also stronger, his kindness now tempered with a wisdom it had lacked before. He finally saw the world not just as it should be, but as it is. I don't regret what I did. Protecting your family is a parent's most fundamental duty, and sometimes that means wielding the truth like a surgeon's scalpel to cut away the disease, no matter how painful the procedure. The lie would have eventually destroyed him, a slow-acting poison. I chose a quick, clean wound instead, one that could heal. The strength of a family, I've learned, isn't in its perfect facade. It's in its resilience, its ability to face the ugliest truths and endure. It's in the quiet love that remains when all the noise and deception have faded away.